Spiritual Christianity by Charles Augustus Tulk. Chapter 5 continued. From Divine Providence 167. In the spiritual world where all, even as to their bodies, are spiritual, the eyes of everyone are formed to see from their own light. The love of each one's life produces an intellect for him, and consequently his light also. For love is the fire of life, and the light of life is its effect. From Arcana Celestia 10135. Angels have their states of love and of light varied, just as in this world the times of the day, morning, noon, evening, night, or twilight, and again the morning are varied in their states. When angels are in a state of love, it is to them morning, and the Lord appears to them as the rising sun. When they are in a state of intellectual light, it is then noon to them. But when they are in a state of obscure mental light, it is then evening to them. And afterwards, when their love is in a state of obscurity, or grows in a measure cold, it is then night to them, or rather, it is the twilight before the dawn of day. Such states as these angels have in continued succession, and by these do they advance continually towards perfection. But these variations do not exist from the sun there as a consequence of its rising and its setting, but from the state of their interior faculties in the angels themselves. From Arcana Celestia 5097. The variations of the light of heaven do not consist, as is the case with the light of this world, in daily and yearly variations, but are variations of intelligence and love. For the light of heaven is no other than divine intelligence from the Lord, which also shines before their eyes, and the warmth of that light is the Lord's divine love, which is also felt as a sensation. It is this light which produces man's intellectual faculty, and it is this warmth which produces his vital heat and his voluntary disposition to goodness. In heaven, the morning is a state of illustrations as to whatever relates to goodness and to truth, which state then exists when goodness is admitted, and still more when it is perceived to be goodness, and the truth to be truth. Perception is an internal revelation, and therefore the morning signifies something revealed, and as that time an object becomes clear, which was before obscure, therefore the morning also signifies a clear state of mind. But besides this, the morning signifies in its supreme sense the Lord himself, for he is the sun whence all the light of heaven is derived, and he is always rising. He is always the morning. He is always rising too with everyone who is receptive of the truth of faith and of the goodness which is produced by love. But on the other hand, he is setting with everyone who is not receptive. Not that the sun sets there, for as was just observed, the sun of heaven is always in its rising. But he who does not receive causes it, as it were, to set with him. From Arcana Celestia 10134. The morning signifies a state of love, with the light which is produced from it in the internal man. And the reason is that when an angel is in a state of love and of light, he is then in his internal man, or mind. But when his state of light and of love is obscured, he is then in the external state of his mind. For angels have both an internal and an external state, and when they are in the former, then the latter is almost quiescent. But when they are in the latter, they are then in a grosser and obscurer state. Hence it is that when they are in a state of love and of light, they are then in an internal state of mind, and thus in their morning. But when their light and love are obscured, they are then in the external state, and consequently in their evening. From this it follows that variations of states are affected by elevations towards the interior faculties, which raises them into a superior sphere of heavenly light and warmth, and as a consequence, nearer the Lord. And they are also affected by diminutions towards the exterior faculties into a lower sphere of heavenly light and warmth, and consequently more remote from the Lord. From Arcana Celestia 9865. In the heavens there appears colours of ineffable beauty, for they are modifications of heavenly light, and heavenly light is the divine truth that proceeds from the Lord. It is clear, therefore, that colours are brought forth to view according to the variations of goodness and of truth, and thus they are modifications of light that proceeds from the Lord through the angels. And from Arcana Celestia 4922. All the colours which are beheld in another life signify some state or other of goodness and of truth, for they exist from the light of heaven, which is in itself is wisdom and intelligence from the Lord's divine essence. The variegations or modifications of that light are variegations from that source, and so to express it, they are modifications of wisdom and intelligence, and thence of goodness and of truth. From Arcana Celestia 9466. In the other life and in heaven itself there appear the most beautiful colours, all of them deriving their origin from goodness and truth. For the sphere of their affections for goodness and of truth is essentially exhibited before the eyes of angels and spirits, even by colours and specific states of mind, by objects variously coloured. For every celestial state of goodness and spiritual state of truth are represented in the lower heaven by such objects as appear in nature, and thus before the very external senses of spirits and angels there. It is said that the sphere of their affection of goodness and of truth are exhibited visibly by colours, and the cause of this is that colours are modifications of heavenly light or of intelligence and wisdom. From Arcana Celestia 4530. Colours are seen in the other life which so surpass in brilliancy and lustre the splendid colours of the world that they can scarcely be compared together. There the colours are produced by the variegation of light and shade, and as in that life it is intelligence and wisdom from the Lord which appear before the eyes of angels and spirits as light, and which at the same time enlightens their intellect within, the colours there are in their essence variations, or, so to express it, modifications of intelligence and wisdom. And that's the end of the readings from the Doctrines of Spiritual Christianity. So moving now on to Tulk's commentary. Point number 59. The passages which have been hitherto examined by explaining the essential properties of a spiritual state of life have to a certain extent enabled us to comprehend from its interior ground the constitution of the spiritual world. At every stage of our progress, the reader has been required as an indispensable condition for the right understanding of spiritual truth, that he lay aside some one or other of his usual or natural modes of thinking, and that his mind be adorned with truths of an interior kind, better fitted to the atmosphere he is beginning spiritually to inhale. He now knows, or ought to know, in some measure, what it is to think above space and time, and what it is to think in them. Because he is now aware of the fact, although as yet he may not have an insight into the reason of the fact, that the two properties of nature, which to those who think in them and not above them, seem to exist independently of themselves, are, in a spiritual state of life, intuitively perceived to be, because they really are, outbursts of spiritual or angelic thought, representing in the various sensuous objects which by their simultaneous presentation to the mind impart the phenomena or appearance of extension. The state of the will in respect to the quality of its love, and in the successive changes of those sensuous objects, the progressive states of the intellect in respect to the form and measure of its wisdom and intelligence. By these means he is learning to direct his attention more to mind and less to matter, and to reverse the estimation and importance in which they are held by the world. For he has now the means of knowing, and, if his reason be satisfied, of believing, that neither space nor time is absolutely indispensable to being, but so far from it that he who is the one only perfect or essential being, who is being in the highest and the strictest sense of the word, is himself wholly devoid of both. And in passing from the infinite to the finite, he has found, connected with the will and intellect in their purest or angelic form, only the appearance of space or distance, and of time and progression, which appearances are the representative effects of the finite or imperfect condition of their own minds. Lower in the scale of conscious life, the acuter and more comprehensive powers of the mind sink and become obscured, while space and time rise into something more than representative importance. For in the estimation of the natural man, who thinks in the fallacies of space and time, so far from being considered as not indispensable to being, they are commonly held to be coessential with God himself, and to be the effects of the immediate and spatial presence of him, who is supposed to be co-extended with the infinite space of nature, and to co-endure through its infinite time. The very God, therefore, of the natural man, which is the phantom of a grovelling imagination, as he is believed to pervade and to be co-extensive with all space, and to have a progressive life, which he has co-endured and will endure through an eternity of time, is mingled and confounded with the two constitutes of nature, and is, in too many instances, a word that signifies not a being, but a thing, which thing, under another name, is nature, his hypothetical nature, traced in thought upward to its most subtle elementary principle. Point number 60. But though we have advanced thus far in the investigation, it is more than probable that my companion on this spiritual journey may not as yet have that clear insight into the truth which he is desirous of possessing, but which can only be obtained by an accurate discrimination between spiritual truth and the natural tendency of our own opinions concerning the creation and preservation of the material universe. By entering upon such an examination, the difference between the two worlds will be obvious, and we shall be better prepared to choose between the two modes of accounting for them. Point number 61. Well has it been said in the extracts which have just been given that, quote, a natural man in all that he thinks and speaks, in all states of his will, and in all that he does, has for his subjects matters, space, time, and quantity. To him these appear fixed and constant, and if he were to be deprived of these, his thought, and his speech also, which is the embodiment of his thought, would be deprived of every idea. End quote. This most persons will, upon reflection, find to be a faithful picture of their own minds, and they may perhaps recognise and admit the following, or some such opinions as the following, to be their own views of the original formation and growth of the mind, and of the creation of the universe. Point number 62. There are but two ways, unless it be a combination of the two, of thinking on these, and every other subject which is worthy of exercising the reason. The one is to think of them after a spiritual manner, as angels think, and the other after a natural manner, as men are accustomed to do. If a man has matter, space, time, and quantity for subjects of thinking, as well as for objects of his thought, he will, in all conclusions to which he arrives, reverse the true order of influx. And if he believingly follow out such conclusions to their inevitable issues, he will end in being a materialist, having a God co-extensive with his material universe and co-enduring with its time. True, it is that fragmentary systems of religion and philosophy have, after a manner, been made up of these two contrary elements, and there are writers who have vainly toiled to effect a compromise between them. But the attempt to mix the iron with the clay has not succeeded. The doctrinal forms which have been fashioned out of such incoherent materials will not bear the handling and fall to pieces at the slightest touch. Point number 63. Just in proportion as a man habituates himself to think in space and time, will he be liable to be misled by the fallacies of sensuous impressions. He will account for the phenomena of life not by the internal laws of spirit, for this would be to think above nature, but superficially by the appearance. The like kind of interpretation which he has been accustomed to give to the sun's apparent motion, before he was taught that in this instant at least, that there was a higher tribunal for appeal, and one which would reverse the judgment of the senses, even such an interpretation in nearly every other instance does he give to life and its phenomena. It is but rarely that science and the reasonings deduced by science have been brought to the aid of spiritual truth. More commonly it serves either to conceal under a show of inductive ingenuity some defect lying at the very foundation of the reasoning, or else dexterously to confirm a fallacy. Point number 64. By absorption of the mind in matter, time and space and quantity, each one considered as extraneous to the thinking being, and as existing independently of him, fallacious appearances of all kinds have been taken for truths. Thus the powers both of the mind and body seem to be derived from without, and as the minds of most persons are so much more absorbed in the impressions which they will derive directly from the senses, that they never stop to examine what grounds they have for their belief. Few people have any other belief than they are actually derived from without by a kind of physical influx. From outward nature, the sensations and thoughts, as well as the sentiments and properties of the mind, seem to be drawn. From the outward world, they seem to have the food by which they are nourished and increase in power. And they seem also to lose in power by a diminution of the nourishment. What more easy and natural, then, than the belief that the mind itself must be an effect dependent upon certain local changes in the subtle elements of nature? This has been so often asserted gravely and deliberately that scarcely anyone thinks of questioning its correctness, and sensations are held to be so many transcripts of a material world, the images of which are conveyed by various media to the sensorium in the brain, and yet there cannot well be conceived a more unfounded assumption. For in order to ascertain that there are transcripts, we should be able to compare the image with its supposed material cause together, and for that purpose they should be both present to our senses, while the fact is we never have and never can have them both, but only one present to us. Be the causes of our sensations what they may, material or spiritual, by our senses we can become acquainted with no other world than a world of sensations. This external world with its space and its time is a purely hypothetical world. And yet who can doubt the existence of such a world when his senses every hour seem to assure him of the fact? The man, therefore, who thinks in space and time will have no doubt of the existence of such a world, and that his sensations are its faithful images.